Unidentified. My Top UFO Cases by Hector V. Bello, March 2018.
The 1973 Skylab Anomaly sighting, low Earth orbit. Skylab was the first American space station launched into orbit May 14, 1973, and the problem plagued from day one. Skylab 3, the second crew to visit, consisted of astronauts Alan Bean, Jack Loosma, and Owen Garriott, tasked with everything from maintenance to experiments, both scientific and medical. They also faced a number of crises during their short tenure, July 28th to September 25th, 1973, all of which were thankfully resolved in one occurrence of a possible otherworldly nature, which never was, an unidentified object that followed the Space Lab reportedly undetected by NASA or NORAD, an event which would become known as UFO in UFO circles as the Skylab 3 UFO incident. A few days before returning to Earth and while out of radio contact, Garriott took photos of an anomalous object from Skylab's wardroom window. The first recorded mention of the incident was between the astronauts and Capcom some 4.5 hours later. Loosma did not tell him about that satellite we saw. Loosma, did you tell him about that satellite we saw? Bean, yes, we saw a great satellite. We didn't know if we told you about it. Loosma, the closest and brightest one we've ever seen. Bean, a huge one. Loosma, we've seen several. It was a red one. Capsule communicator, no, you may have told someone, but it wasn't this team. I don't remember hearing about it. Loosma, I guess we didn't record it. It was reflecting in red light and oscillating at, counted its period of brightness to dimness, about 10 seconds. It led us to sunset. It led us into sunset. That was about 3 revs ago, I think, something like that. Wasn't it, Owen? No answer. A further allusion to the anomaly took place during a debriefing on October 4th, 1973. Garriott, do you want to talk about that satellite? Loosma, I saw a couple of satellites that appeared like a satellite would on Earth. I saw one that was not like one you would see on Earth. So why don't you mention it? Garriott, okay, about a week or 10 days before recovery, and we were still waiting for information to be supplied to us about the identification. Jack first notices this rather large red star out of the wardroom window. Upon close examination, it was much brighter than Jupiter or any of the other planets. It had a reddish hue to it, even though it was well above the horizon. The light from the sun was not passing close to the Earth's limb at the time. We observed its for about 10 minutes prior to sunset. It was slowly rotating because it had a variation with brightness with a 10-second period. As I was saying, we observed it for about 10 minutes until we went into the darkness. And it also followed us into the darkness for about 5 seconds later. From the 5 to 10 seconds delay in its disappearance, we surmised that it was not more than 30 or 50 nautical miles from our location. From its original position in the wardroom window, it did not move more than 10 to 20 degrees over the 10 minutes or so that we watched it. Its orbit was very close to that of our own. We never saw it on any earlier or succeeding orbits, and we'd be quite interested in having its identification established. It's all debriefed in terms of time on channel A, so the precise timing and location can be picked up from there. Apparently the channel A recorder was off, so determining the precise time and location of Skylab using that method was not possible. The information was later determined using NORAD tracking data. So that so was so what so what was the large mysterious object purportedly undetected by NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, that was observed in such close proximity to Skylab and its crew by its crew? Was it a piece of space junk, a terrestrial satellite, an extraterrestrial visitor, a flaw on the camera's film, or a smudge on the wardroom window? All have been offered up as possibilities, none with great degree of certainty. Skylab's re-entry took place on July 11th, 1979, part of the debris scattering around the Western Australia. Later calculations, admittedly based on a series of assumptions, indicated the object to be much larger than Skylab, which at 78 tons was the largest man-made construct in orbit at the time. Mir, launched in 1986 and weighed 120 tons, with the International Space Station weighs in about 500 tons. Garriott later changed his story somewhat, saying the object did not lead the Skylab into the sunset, but rather followed it. The Shire of Esperance, an area covering 16,427 square miles, fined the United States government $400 for littering. The fine was paid in April 2009 by an American radio show host who, after raising money from his listeners, paid it off on behalf of NASA. The Skylab 3 mission, UFO Photographs of 1973 by James Oberg, published December 21st, 2011. Maccabee and Sparks have an impressive webpage on the notorious squiggle photograph that makes some highly dubious leaps of logic. First, they assume that the four photos Garriott took, the three that showed only a point of light, were the flawed ones, and the squiggle is the true actual image. Second, they assume that the unanimous eyewitness testimony of all three astronauts, being Garriott and Loosma, that they saw an unusually bright point of light, red tinged and slowly periodically varying in brightness, was all disregardable when balanced against the one of four photographs. Within the past 2 years, I've met face to face with Garriott and Loosma for other purposes, but discussed the sighting with them. I've also discussed it by phone with Bean, who lives in Houston, but I am not a frequent visitor at his home studio, but read his book's account of the sighting. I first met these men in the 1970s when I went to work at the Johnson Space Center, and have stayed in touch for over the years. To my knowledge, either Maccabee or nor Sparks has ever contacted them directly. The interpretation of the object's imminent sunset at a different time than Skylab dimmed as an indicator of the object's actual large range is flawed on two counts. First, the interpretation requires assumptions of the object's altitude and other orbital characteristics that are merely convenient guesses and cannot otherwise be corroborated. Second, the assumption that there was no other possible explanation for the difference in dimming time than larger physical separation shown up as different sunset times is incomplete. There's another common illumination phenomenon that allows objects near a space vehicle to move in or out of sunlight that is totally independent of orbital sunrise sunset, that is shadowing by the observing spacecraft, and optical phenomenon seen in some space shuttle TV downlinks of water dumps and views of other small drifting nearby objects shed by the shuttle. This alternative explanation was not, as best I recall, discussed or eliminated by McCabe and Sparks. The prosaic explanation of the dot as a nearby Skylab shed piece of debris is supported by three arguments. First, similar Skylab shed small debris was observed on all three Skylab missions, mostly as dots transiting the solar disk during observations using the station's solar telescope. Two, the wardroom window through which this particular object was observed was on the down sun side of the station, and during the sunset phase of each orbit, the station was casting an invisible umbra, extending hundreds of meters down sun. Because the station had already crossed the Earth's terminator, the surface below was in darkness and hence not reflecting sunlight back up into this shadow zone, as happens during most of every daylight pass. So anything in that zone would not be illuminated and would not be visible, sometimes moving near the station, originally away from it, but quickly into a possible parallel or closing path. Could move from sunlight into this zone and appear to vanish. 3. The long duration of the observation, measured in minutes, eliminates the possibility of it being an independent satellite in any different orbit. This is because satellites in crossing orbits have such high relative velocity that the angular velocity is too large, even for most eyeball detection, much less minutes of patient watching. Note that here I am conceding McCabe's argument from the Gemini 11 case that the UFO could not have been the Soviet Proton satellite because it remained in visual and camera range too long. I now favor Sparks' view that the crew observed a bundle of surplus spacewalk tools jettisoned manually a few hours earlier. I also can report an independent search of known large satellites in orbit at the time, including classified vehicles whose orbital data was released decades later, and agree that no other independent satellite affords an explanation of the sighting. But Skylab shed debris was never observed from the ground, too small, and not tracked. 4. Less powerful is another argument that an object of the actual physical size postulated by McCabe and Sparks would have been a bizarre naked eye object of discernible angular size in the skies of Africa as it passed directly across that continent. Yet, to my knowledge, no UFO reports remotely related in appearance, timing, or direction have ever been found. Considering the known visual stimuli endangered by the Skylab vehicle, the particular illumination conditions of the sunset shadow, and the unanimous testimony of all three witnesses as verified by 3 of the 4 photographs taken, I see no compelling case to believe the fourth image is anything but a camera or processing artifact. Again, this article by James Oberg